Chapter 18, The Progressive Era, 1900 to 1916, Part 3. Progressivism was a worldwide movement. In the early 20th century, cities around the world experienced similar problems caused by industrialization and massive growth. In 1850, only two cities, London and Paris, had a population of more than 1 million. By 1900, there were 12 in Europe and the United States, New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia being those three. Reformers around the world exchanged ideas and proposed new social policies. As Britain, France, and Germany created old age pensions, minimum wage laws, unemployment insurance, and regulated workplace safety, American reformers started to advocate such social legislation. Progressives thought modern society required basic changes in the functions of political authority, whether to check the power of corporations, protect consumers, civilize market relations, or guarantee industrial freedom in the workplace. Influenced by Gilded Age and European reforms, progressives sought to renew notions of an activist, socially conscious government. They rejected old assumptions that powerful government threatened liberty. They saw freedom as a positive, not a negative concept, in which freedom represented the power of the government to intervene in public and private life to improve society. In America, with a decentralized federal system of government, most progressive reforms were enacted at the state and local levels. Progressives attempted to reduce the power of political bosses, assert public control over natural monopolies like gas and water works, and improve public transportation. They raised property taxes to spend more on schools, parks, and other public facilities. And because state legislatures defined the powers of city governments, urban progressives often took reform campaigns to the state level. The most influential state-level progressive administration was that of Robert M. La Follette, who made Wisconsin a laboratory for democracy. After serving as a Republican congressman, La Follette became convinced that an alliance of railroad and lumber companies controlled state politics. When elected governor in 1900, he passed a series of measures that came to be known as the Wisconsin Idea. Nominations of candidates for election through primary elections rather than party bosses, taxation on corporate wealth, and state regulation of railroads and public utilities. Progressives wanted to restore democracy by returning political power to citizens and civic harmony to a divided America. Afraid of violent class conflict and corporate power, they thought political reforms would help create a unified people devoted to greater democracy and social reconciliation. But increasing government power made it more necessary to determine who should be able to participate in politics. Progressive political reforms were often contradictory. The electorate was expanded and contracted, empowered and removed from influencing government. Democracy was expanded by the 17th Amendment, which made U.S. senators elected by popular vote rather than by state legislatures, by adoption of popular election of judges, and by primary elections among party members to select candidates. Several states adopted the initiative, which were voter-proposed legislations, the referendum, voters directly vote on a proposal, and recall, voters remove officials. The era ended with suffrage for women, the largest democratic expansion in American history, but some progressive reforms also restricted democracy, notably the disenfranchisement of blacks in the South. Many localities replaced elected mayors with appointed, nonpartisan commissions or city managers, removing local government from the control of political machines, but also popular control. New literacy tests and residency and registration requirements limited the right to vote among the poor and migrants. Progressive electoral reforms marked a retreat from the notion that voting was an inherent right of American citizenship. Most white progressives were also disinterested in the plight of African Americans. Most progressives were leery of the real world of politics in which people pursued narrow class, ethnic, or regional interests. Many progressives thus turned to college professors and other so-called experts, believing government could ensure intelligent rule over society through a democracy run by impartial experts unaccountable to citizens. This was part of progressives' impulse toward order, efficiency, and centralized management as a means of ensuring social justice. In Drift and Mastery, in 1914, Walter Lippmann argued the nation could either continue to drift, operating according to a dated belief in individual autonomy, or embrace mastery, using scientific inquiry to address modern social problems. For Lippmann and others, political freedom rested not in direct political participation, but in the formation of public policy by the most qualified. But progressivism also contained a more democratic vision of an activist government, perhaps best expressed by women reformers. Still unable to vote and hold office in most states, women were central to progressive politics. They challenged barriers to political participation and elaborated a democratic grassroots vision of government. They were moved to act most often by the conditions faced by poor immigrant communities and women and children workers. The era's most prominent female reformer was Jane Addams. Addams never married and resisted expectations to become tied to a family as a mother and wife, and instead, in 1889, founded Hull House in Chicago, a settlement house dedicated to improving the lives of the immigrant poor. Settlement house workers moved into poor neighborhoods, built and ran schools, employment bureaus, and health clinics, and even helped women victims of domestic abuse. By 1910, more than 400 settlement houses had been established in cities around the nation. Addams typified the era's new woman, as more and more women went to college and entered professions such as social services, nursing, and education. Middle-class women's efforts to help the poor, working women, and children helped expand government's role in society. Through settlement and other social work, these women learned that legislation was necessary for dealing with housing, income, and health inequalities. Hull House led a number of campaigns for legislation in Illinois around shorter working hours, workplace safety, and union organizing rights, which inspired others to do likewise. In the South, however, race affected reform, as ending child labor was justified as necessary for giving white children the education they would need as members of the South's ruling race. The settlement houses have been called spearheads of reform, and they produced prominent progressive leaders, such as Julia Lathrop, the first woman to head a federal agency, which was the Children's Bureau founded in 1912 to investigate conditions of mothers and children and advocate for them, and Florence Kelley, who organized the National Consumer League to use purchasing power as a way to force manufacturers to improve working conditions. After 1900, the campaign for women's suffrage became a mass movement for the first time. The National American Women's Suffrage Association's membership grew enormously, and its campaigns had some success in states, half of which allowed women to vote in local elections regarding schools. It won women's suffrage in Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, and Utah. Between 1910 and 1914, 7 more western states gave women the vote. These campaigns were conducted with a new spirit of militancy and used modern methods of advertising, publicity, and entertainment, characteristics of mass consumer societies. But state campaigns were costly, and increasingly efforts focused on gaining suffrage at the national level. The celebration of women's domestic role actually inspired the suffrage movement. Many progressive proposals emerged from the idea that the state should protect women and children, and female reformers formed a movement for improving the lives of poor mothers and children. Many states enacted pensions for mothers to enable them to care for children. Such maternalist reforms were based on the assumption that government should encourage women's ability to bear and raise children and allow them to be economically independent. Other progressive laws recognized that women worked outside the home, but defined them as dependent groups, like children, that needed state protection in ways male workers were not. In the landmark case, Mueller v. Oregon, in 1908, the U.S. Supreme Court accepted the arguments of Brandeis that long hours of labor were dangerous for women whose childbearing abilities required government protection. This was the first major breach of liberty of contract doctrine, just 3 years after the Lochner decision. But the costs of Mueller were high, as while even more states passed protective laws for women workers, these laws both benefited women and tied them to their family roles, and kept reinforced gender discrimination and exclusion in labor markets. Though the use of government to regulate working conditions raised questions about liberty of contract, maternalist policies built gender inequality into the early foundations of the welfare state. Brandeis imagined a different kind of welfare state from that of maternalists, one rooted less in healthy motherhood than the ideas of universal economic entitlements, such as a right to a decent income and protection against unemployment and work-related accidents. The right to assistance for Brandeis derived from citizenship, not some special service to the nation, as in the case of mothers. Some states supported the kind of welfare Brandeis envisioned, and they passed workmen's compensation laws that drew upon workers' own wages to create a fund for workers injured on the job. Yet the idea of universal entitlements and protections for all workers, including male workers, would be expressed in policy in the New Deal era.